Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Faerie Conclave. This is episode number 67. I am your host, Alec. My pronouns are he, him, and joining me on the line is a very special guest. It's Joey. How are you doing today, Joey?
Hi, I'm doing very, very well. Thank you so much for having me on. This is a real treat.
Honestly, it's a real treat for me. I have been listening to your podcast, the EDHRECast, for years at this point.
Oh, wow.
And it's one of my favorite podcasts for Magic. It's one of the ones where as soon as an episode gets posted, I'm like, all right, here's what we're doing on my lunch break today.
Oh man, that that warms my heart a lot. Thank you. It's been really awesome to see the show's wings spread and for it to take off the way that it has. We're really pleased with it. It's a really, really fun show to do. So I guess let me do a more proper introduction for myself.
Sounds good,
maybe?
yeah.
So yeah, hi everyone. I'm Joey Schultz, he, him, and I am the lead editor for the content branch of EDHREC. I host the EDHRECast, a podcast where me and my co-hosts look at all the data that's on EDHREC and try to give all of those stats and percentages and popularity metrics more context within the world of the Commander format. And as a warning, we are all about data and dad jokes. So many puns. It's a little bit pun bearable. But I'm also the lead editor for the article content on EDHREC, and I make additional content with my co-editor Chase, aka Mana Curves, on the EDHRECast YouTube channel. And one of our favorite series is one called Upping the Average. We're just up to a whole bunch of extra content for EDHREC. It's a really fun time.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of all of it. I very much enjoy how it's a lot of like data and very data based and all of that with an engineering background myself. It just it makes a lot of sense, and yeah, I get really excited when there are graphs involved. So
yeah, and it's also great too because I mean it is a lot of data, but it's also just data. And I mean, sometimes we think that people are playing cards too much, or that there are cards that are super underplayed. So that's one of our favorite things to do as well, is not to just take the data as, quote, the correct thing, but we'll sort of investigate it more. We'll interrogate the numbers a little bit more and see, is this revealing something? Like, do we feel that this is true about our experiences playing the format? Is this something that is overrepresented in the format for some reason? Are these cards that people just don't know about, but they ought to? What are these cool hidden gems? It's just a terrific time.
Yeah, I love the challenging the stats segments. I think that especially when they're kind of precons related, I often find a lot of cards in the precons that are like heavily represented in data, and you're like, maybe this really shouldn't be here. Like, let's kind of talk about this. I think, not taking the data at face value is really important, and it's always entertaining too to kind of trash on cards you don't like, or try to like bring your pet cards up to the forefront a little more.
Yeah, for sure. We've got a couple of different terms, a couple of different patterns that we see. The precon effect, like you just mentioned, is one of them, where cards might be popular because they showed up in a precon, and like if that commander had come out in a regular standard expansion, then maybe those cards wouldn't be in their deck data. But since they were sort of attached to that card at its initial release, like they kind of have a pairing up that isn't necessarily warranted. In the future, you kind of hope that maybe those numbers will change a little bit, or I don't know, gives you stuff to challenge, stuff to continue to explore. I guess would be a way to say it. But then it is difficult too to there are cards where I'm just like, oh, well, I think that's overplayed. But then one of my co-hosts will be like, no, Joey, that's not overplayed at all. That card's amazing. And I'm like, dang it. Like because everyone has their favorite pet cards too. So it's really funny to discover each other's sort of thematic preoccupations within the game while we're talking about the stuff that we see as trends over the entire format. So there are a lot of personal predilections that we each have that you get to see as you are investigating more of all of that data. It really reveals not just a lot about the format, but also a lot about yourself, and I find that very edifying too.
That's exactly why I like Commander so much. Is it's this beautiful like Venn diagram between data and just kind of personal feeling and like putting yourself into your decks. Because I'm always like, okay, we need 10 of this type of card, like 10 removal spells, 12 ramp spells, things like that. Very like numbers and data based, but then I'll play the deck a few times. I'm like, okay, I feel like it needs more of this.
Yeah, wait a second. My commander is Tatiova, and she draws me so many cards that why am I playing 10 draw spells? Like that
Exactly.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's all these little nuances that can really affect those balances. It's tough, and one of the only things that's ever going to teach you the best lessons is the actual practical experience and not a bunch of numbers on a spreadsheet. So that's one of the things we like to dig into. And yeah, personal experience is going to trump it every single time. It's very, very difficult, but super enjoyable. Again, that's like you said, the personality that you get to infuse into the game is it's so terrific.
Yeah, I love it so much. It brings me so much joy, and yeah, it's good. And so you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I wanted to quickly go through our community spotlight for the episode. So this is where we shout out another content creator. Yeah, because Magic has such a wonderful community, and we love to talk about it and shout people out. And so you mentioned the Upping the Average YouTube series, which you do, Joey, and it's on YouTube. So that's what we're going to shout out today, because I think it's super valuable information for when you're building one of those commanders. For example, I think your most recent one was Ishin, the new Attack Harmonicon commander.
Yeah.
You went through a couple like rules non-bows that happen with that attack trigger. And that's something that I maybe wouldn't have noticed building that commander. And so I think things like that are super valuable for people who are looking to build those commanders.
Yeah, it is. I think I was saying before we officially started recording, I was so overjoyed to see how the response to that series has been, because I was kind of sitting on that idea for a while, and I was kind of under the impression that I might be the only one who actually liked the idea. But I started doing it, and it really took off. And it's delightful. So for what I do in that series is I take the average deck data, which is compiled by all of the metrics and all of the stats on EDHREC. You know, it will see that, oh, this commander usually plays, you know, the average deck shows us that the average this commander on average plays 25 creatures. So it'll take the 25 most popular creatures, or it plays, you know, this many lands, and it'll take that number of lands, and it sort of all throws that into one big average deck, which is a really fantastic feature for folks who don't want to worry themselves too much about optimizing a deck. They really just want to get down and play a game ASAP. Give me a list. Like, I don't want to futz around with the deck too much. Let's just get a list and go. And that's a really great feature for a whole lot of folks, and it illuminates a lot about the ways, the most common patterns for that commander too. But, you know, it's a bunch of averages, and that's why for me I was like, well, I think we can tweak some of those though. So I take that average deck list, I put it into a deck building website, and I go over it. I play test a lot with it, and I'm like, what are some things that I think could take this from being a good start for a player and take it to a great start for someone? What are some other things that maybe aren't well represented in this commander's data just yet that it could be playing a little bit more, that aren't very high in its numbers but should be? And what are some cards that, therefore, when you're making tweaks, you have to cut something? What are the cards that maybe aren't serving this commander as well given its current build? And so, yeah, there are some rules non-bows that you might run into because a card looks like it might work one way, but it doesn't necessarily work that way. And I really like to use that as an opportunity to highlight very interesting things about rules for a commander. But I also just like finding hidden gems. That's one of my favorite aspects to that series too. So yeah, the reception to it honestly has been really, really heartwarming, and I love doing it. It's easily one of my favorite parts of working for EDHREC is being able to craft that series in addition to the podcast, in addition to editing all the content. But the Upping the Average has really been my darling over the course of the past couple of years, and I'm so happy that people love it so much.
Yeah, I'm happy to see a new episode every time, and I think it's super valuable information just because when you take averages of things, just in general, it can kind of come out a little strange. And so taking that average and and just kind of going through each card and talking about like these types of cards work great in this deck, and like no judgment if you're playing them, because it still does stuff and it works, but there's like a little interaction here, something there that you might want to consider a different type of card in this slot type of thing. I also appreciate how you always do a like reducing the budget section.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, I know it can be a bit scary when you pull that average deck list and it's like $900, $1,300, but then when you really look into it, it's a fetch land and a couple other like 5 cards that are contributing to that.
That's one of the things that is so interesting to me about that series too, is that, so the rule for my series is that I can't make any swaps that would increase the overall price of the deck. If anything, I want to try and keep it neutral, or I want to lower the cost if I can. And then very frequently, I'll also do either honorable mentions for very budget cards, or I'll have 2 deck lists for the episode, where one of them is the more budget list. Because yeah, you pull it up and it's like, here's a starting deck that is $300, and that looks like a lot at first, but like, I mean, most precons these days are starting at like 250 or something,
Right,
I think.
yeah.
Something to that effect. I don't know the exact number, but yeah, you'll pull up a list and it'll be like, all right, this starting deck is $700. And it's like, all right, well, that looks a little bit intimidating. Let's investigate. Oh, it turns out that if I cut the land base, which has all of the shocks and the triumphs and the fetchers and all of those, I cut out over half of that price. And if I cut out the Stefari's protection and the smothering tithe, I save another $100. So
yeah.
the culprits for that huge price tend to be consolidated in just a few cards. It's not like the deck is all made of $10 cards. It's a bunch of things that cost a quarter, and then a couple of outliers that cost like 50, 40 bucks. So yeah, that's another really fun aspect to that series as well, is kind of challenging myself to find weirder cards that aren't super popular. Because, it's not a direct correlation, but super popular cards can have an effect on a card's demand and therefore its price. But it's a challenge for me, but it's also just practical. Like, I don't want to spend $700 on a new deck. Like, if I am genuinely building this commander, I don't want to drop the $700 on it. A budget-friendly approach that helps me get started with the deck is going to be a whole lot more useful to me. So I want to respect the folks who are playing at the level that the average is representing, and the folks who are trying to get into it without committing super hard with their wallets to it as well. So that's also extremely fun.
Yeah, I love it. So I have one question about a lot of the decks I see in the series that I'd like to get your take on. So whenever I build a commander deck, I always start with 38 lands, which is just like, it's a lot. It's a little bit too much probably for some decks, but I feel like just starting there is always a safe place. And sometimes I like get a little worried when you pull the average deck data and they're like 33 lands, 32 lands, and it's like a 5-mana commander. Yeah.
Me too. That happens a lot. And there are some cases where a lower land count is justified. An elf tribal deck has so many mana producing cards in the 99 and amongst its elf tribal cards that it's going to be, you don't want to flood out necessarily. But there is definitely a tendency that I see in that series where it's just like, starting deck is 34 lands, and I'm just like, okay, but the commander's 7 mana. How is this happening?
Yes.
I don't know if this necessarily. I'm not sure. But that's a thing to tackle. Again, that's why it's just averages.
Right.
And you have to find something that will actually suit you. And it's also really interesting. I mean, there are some commanders that I don't know how to do a video about at all, such as Atraxa, for example, because the average for Atraxa, you're going to see 25% of players are doing Super Friends, and another 25% of players are doing Infect, and another 25% of players are doing +1 counters. And if you average all of those out, you're going to get a big mishmash hodgepodge. But that isn't properly representative of any one of those strategy styles or players' decks. So there are a lot of interesting things that you can learn, but averages are just averages, and that's again the point of creating content for EDHREC is to investigate all of those numbers a lot more, because there's a lot more that you can find when you are critical of them too, so that you can personalize the stuff so much more.
I love it. Yeah, I think it's super valuable. So anyone who's out there who maybe hasn't seen this YouTube series yet, I will have a link to it in the episode description below. So definitely go check it out, especially if Joey has done one of your commanders already, or one that you're thinking of. Definitely, go watch those videos.
I love getting requests. I love seeing folks are so excited. And it's great too to see folks who are just like, I don't even want to build the Ur-Dragon, but I loved watching your thoughts about how this deck works and stuff like that. And just like, that is one of the best comments I think you can ever receive for anything that you do, is that folks are still loving it, even if it doesn't necessarily apply to their stuff. But like, I do want to make stuff for people that is useful. So if you've got requests, I love hearing them. I would love to know what people want me to tackle next.
Yeah, definitely. And even if you're not building the decks yourself, I've had friends who, like one of my friends is working on an Ishin deck right now, and I was like, okay, here's the link, you got to check out this video, because
Thank you.
Joey goes through the whole thing, and I watched it. I'm not building the deck, but I thought it was super interesting. So yeah,
that's very kind. Thank you.
Of course. And so that was our community spotlight, and so I guess we should get into, Joey, why you're on the show exactly today, which is for Commander Deck interview. So at the Faerie Conclave, we love to do Commander Deck interviews because it gets a really nice like deep dive into somebody's favorite decks, and it's really cool. I think you get to see a lot of somebody's personality when they talk about their deck, and it's just fun to talk about Commander decks. So my first question for you, Joey, is could you tell us who your commander is today that we're going to talk about, and a little bit of the background of what inspired you to build this deck?
For sure. So I am Mr. Graveyard amongst most of the folks that I play with. My meta, I guess you could say, which includes my family. My entire family plays. My brothers, my stepdad, and my mom, and they all know that I am the necromancy guy. I put the romance in necromancy.
Amazing.
I know, I'm insufferable. I'm sorry. So when in Midnight Hunt, the commander Wilhelt the Rotcleaver was released, I took interest because he's all about zombies. So he's the 4-mana 3/3 zombie warrior in Dimir, and he says whenever another zombie you control dies, if it didn't have Decayed, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed, which can't block, and when the Decayed creatures attack, they sacrifice themselves at the end of combat. And at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice a zombie to draw a card. So he om-noms on some zoms. He just slowly fills your hand and your graveyard. And so I took interest in this guy, which is actually a little unusual for me. I mean, I love the graveyard, which is what, got me curious about this, but I'm not usually a tribal deck player. I don't usually like elf tribal or goblin tribal or dragon tribal. Those don't usually appeal to me, but this commander for some reason did. And I started looking at it. I saw the precon. I was like, maybe let's try this out. And then, despite myself, I fell head over heels in love with this deck so much. And it's just so great. Because I love reanimator strategies. I love cheating stuff into play. And we've seen dozens of zombie tribal decks before. And usually, again, tribal decks, it's not a vibe that I'm not usually on that wavelength. But Wilhelt is beautiful. He's a little card draw engine in the command zone that also helps me sacrifice stuff and makes a bunch of tokens. He's beautiful. I just want to eat your brains.
So I've been really excited for this deck to talk to you about it because I think we have a lot in common when it comes to play styles. I'm also like in our meta, usually the graveyard person. I never leave home without my Animate Dead in my decks. And we've also interviewed a couple other zombie commanders. Like we did a Scarab God on the show, and we've also done Gisa and Geralf on the show before. Thinking about those, and I also have a Scarab God deck, but recently I've kind of felt a similar way where I don't know, the tribal elements just don't really resonate with me as much as I thought they would, I guess. And so I was thinking about Wilhelt, and I think out of kind of all of the zombie options, it's like the most zombie-y that ever zombied out of this pile of zombie commanders, and is also a zombie itself, which is kind of unique compared to the other ones. So
that is true. Yeah, Scarab God, Gieson, Geralf, there are a couple out there that aren't necessarily members of the same tribe. And I think we've also gotten to understand a lot of what some of the others do. Grimgrin is very commonly associated with being a combo deck because he has this specific thing that you can do with a Rooftop Storm and a Gravecrawler. Scarab God is sometimes almost more of a control deck than he necessarily, quote, needs to be a zombie tribal deck. But then Wilhelt is here being part of the tribe and making new members of the tribe. He replaces your stuff when it dies. And I think that, to me, is the ultimate appeal. I love the resiliency of necromancy decks because it means you can never get rid of me for good. I will make zombies if you wrath my board. That is so wonderful. If you strike me down, I will rise again more powerful than you can imagine. That sort of thing. So go ahead, wipe my board, but I'm gonna get a couple extra decayed zombies left over, and they're gonna hit you back. I'm gonna get the last word in, and it's just a delightful extra threat on top of it that I just think makes for such terrific and wonderful styles and opportunities for gameplay.
It's also extremely thematic to zombies because they're zombies, like they're hard to kill. So and one thing that Wilhelt when it was kind of first previewed, I think I was pretty down on decayed zombies and things like that. But since then, I've played a lot with Jedar, the Ghoul Caller, which makes decayed zombies every turn, and I've been loving that card in my like aristocrats decks and other decks that just need creatures, because sacrificing, like being forced to sacrifice them when they attack, is gonna trigger all of your sacrifice effects and all these other things that you have going on. And I didn't even think about that. I was like, oh, you only get to attack once? That's silly. But really, it's like you want them to be sacrificed a lot of the time.
Yes, yeah. Your Undead Augur will trigger whenever a zombie dies, so you'll draw more cards. Or, oh lord, what is it? Vengeful Dead is another one. Vengeful Dead and Plague Belcher both make your opponents lose life whenever your zombies die. So, okay, I'll attack you, deal some damage. My zombies will fall apart, and you'll lose even more life. Not to mention, you can use those as sacrifice fodder for something like a Victimize, to sacrifice a creature and bring 2 other creatures back. Yeah, there's so many uses for these extra tokens that you're supplied with. I love them so much.
Me too. Yeah, I've become a huge fan, and I've recently been playing a lot of Eloise Nephalia Sleuth, which is a really fun Dimir commander that cares about sacrificing tokens and creatures specifically. And I've been looking at a lot of decayed cards and playing those because, yeah, just sacrificing your creatures, triggering your commander's effects, getting all these things. It's really good. Yeah, I'm a big fan. The next question I've got is, this one is, I'm interested to see, because this is a pretty recent commander that has come out. But I'm sure since you first put the deck together, you have made some swaps or some changes as you played it. So do you have any kind of cards that you'd like to shout out that maybe you tried but didn't quite work? Anything like that?
Sure. But I think that most of these will just be personal choices, and they're like, there are going to be folks who will hear, wait, you cut that card? I can't believe you. That card's so good. And like, it's true. A lot of the cards that I cut are objectively good zombie tribal cards, but there was a specific style that I was searching for. So basically, a lot of the non-zombie cards are the ones that I ended up I've removed quite a lot of those over time, such as the original Ghoul Caller Gisa or Gisa and Geralf. I even decided against acquiring a Scarab God, for example. Gotcha. I think the only non-zombie card I'm playing right now is Species Specialist, because he just draws me so many cards when my zombie tokens die. And that's so many cards that it overflows the hand, so I discard the hand size, and that means I have more stuff in the graveyard to reanimate. It's delightful. But yeah, I just whenever I cast like a zombie apocalypse, I don't want it to kill off a lot of my own creatures too. Whenever I play a Lord, I want it to pump up all of my creatures in play, because this is kind of a deck where I want to be just as brainless as the zombies. I just want it to play, and I want to laugh and giggle at the stuff that it's doing. I don't want to think too much about what I'm doing. I'm just like, this is zombies. I'm just here to have a funny time. There are a few cards that I did end up removing that I do think are worth investigating for a lot of other players out there. Specifically, Death Tyrant is the big one. Because he says that whenever one of your attacking creatures dies, he'll make you a new zombie token. And the decayed zombies attack and fall apart during combat. That counts as an attacking creature that you control dying. So Death Tyrant makes new zombies for you, which is amazing.
Wow.
You can also use like Teferi's Veil. So whenever you attack with stuff, it phases out the attacking creatures at the end of combat. So you can actually avoid ever sacrificing your decayed tokens at all, because instead they just cease to exist and come back on your next turn. And those are terrific cards. I've personally moved away from them because I was just kind of honing right in on just like, I'm just going to play funny zombie stuff. But those are some cool synergies that, while I've moved away from them, I think are definitely worth exploring for a lot of other Wilhelt players.
I love it. I think there is probably a really cool build of this deck that is centered around Teferi's Veil and keeping all of your decayed creatures and zombies and things like that. I think, that's a really spicy one that... I never would have thought about this interaction, but that's really cool.
Oh, and I guess another thing I should say too is that another extension of this is that I also don't play any of the combos that Wilhelt has become a little bit associated with as well. There's like, I think it's like a Poppet Stitcher or Poppet Factory or something like that like removes the decayed status from your decayed zombies so that it would make infinite zombies and stuff like that. Or there are Grave Crawler combos that you can do, and those are all terrific, but it's just not necessarily what I was after. I actually ended up getting rid of a couple of different sacrifice outlets, like Carrion Feeder, for example, because it made the deck very aristocratsy. And again, I just want to eat some brains. I just want to go chomp chomp with my zombies. I just want to cast funny zombie spells. So it's again kind of like my brainless deck. But those are all interesting avenues to explore for different players for sure. But personalizing it for me, I'm just like, I don't know what's going to happen. It's just a bunch of zombie stuff, and so that's the focus that I've gone with it, and it just makes me giggle every single game. I love playing this guy so much.
And that's one thing. I think it's really good that you have kind of the purpose of the deck very like solid, and you kind of base the deck around that, because something we talk a lot about on this podcast is the quote unquote beginning of the night decks, where you have your full brain power and you're moving lots of tokens around. That's usually when I'll play my sagas deck, because there's so many things to keep track of when there are a bunch of sagas out that it's like you need a lot of brain power for that. And then there are the end of the night decks, which for me it's like mono green hydras and ramping or something like that. You don't need to think about it that much. You just play out your things. And I think knowing kind of which section your deck falls into and then kind of leaning into that it's a really good way to do it. Okay, so I've gotten from a lot of the things we've talked about so far what you like most about playing this deck. But is there anything else you'd like to talk about as far as the kind of like goals of the deck and what it's trying to achieve that make you like playing it? Yeah,
honestly, I think the thing I like most about playing the deck is that it's one of the decks that I feel most comfortable playing with my folks, with my whole family. I mentioned all of us play, and it's my usual shindig in Magic is a reanimator strategy, but I don't always feel comfortable playing that with my family, because reanimator strategies are kind of easy to be absurdly broken to cheat a bunch of stuff into play all of the time.
That's true.
So I like that this is a very straightforward strategy that lets me still do all of my necromancy stuff without necessarily getting too big for its britches, so to say.
Gotcha, yeah.
And again, I just love how resilient the deck is, because the Decayed Zombies will let me have those extra bouts of weird stuff to do. After a Wrath happens and I have a board full of tokens left over, I play a single Zombie Lord, and now all of those 2/2s left over are actually really dangerous. I love saying, I'll leave Wilhelt in the graveyard instead of putting him back into the command zone, because I'm going to cast a reanimator spell like a Patriarch's Bidding or a Victimize, just sacrifice one of those Decayed Zombies, bring back my commander without having to pay for it all over again. Those are some of my favorite moments. And I'll definitely shout out the card Empty the Laboratory as well, which is a polymorph for all of your zombies. So if you have a board full of tokens, you can cast Empty the Laboratory, sacrifice all of those tokens, and then it flips cards from your deck until you find that many zombies, and you put them right into play. And it's just so silly. It's so silly. So it's wild. It's an unpredictable mess of stuff that I can turn my brain off and play at a level that I feel everyone's going to be able to enjoy. I like that this is a deck that I can play where my opponents, my family, the folks that I'm playing, watching on stream, on our stuff like that. Like I love how excited everyone gets when we're playing this deck. It's not just a thing that I'm enjoying. It's everyone is going, wait, what do these cards do? Because they're so wild.
Yeah, that's definitely what I enjoy too. I think in general, zombie decks are really good at like slowly building momentum and then kind of reaching this point where it's snowballed so much that you can't stop it, and there's just a ton of zombies. And one thing that I think is really cool with Wilhelt specifically is just in the last 3 or 4 sets, we've gotten so many cool, specifically zombie cards like Empty the Laboratory. And a couple that I've played against a lot recently are Necro Duality and Cleaver Scab, which those two cards do some work.
Yes, so I am definitely playing those. And by the way, Cleaver Scab, I did not realize this the first time that I played with Cleaver Scab. But Cleaver Scab lets you sacrifice a zombie to make 2 copies of that zombie. It doesn't have to sacrifice a non-token. It can make copies of the things you've already copied. You can make tokens and then sacrifice those tokens to make more. I actually found that out when I was on Chase's stream, Mana Curve stream, and we were playing a game against Aaron Hansen of Game Grumps fame. And he, I think, actually is the one who pointed it out to me. He's just like, you can sacrifice that Grey Merchant of Asphodel, which happens to be a zombie. You can sacrifice that to make copies of it, and then you can sacrifice the tokens to make more copies of it. And I think I die. It was just this delightful. Yeah, those token cards are so good. Necro Duality is amazing. I've got Reflections of Yara in there as well. The tokens are It's so it's beautiful. It's such an amazing piece of work.
That's funny. I honestly, I don't think I had realized that it was not non-zombie on that card. And as soon as you pointed that out, I like my eyes went straight down to Grey Merchant of Asphodel. So
He's a zombie. I can't believe he's
amazing.
A zombie.
That's so good. Yeah, I think one of my other favorites from recent sets is Overcharged Amalgam.
Yes.
So sweet. 2 blue for a 3/3 flash, flying, and exploit, which I love to see exploit. That's always been one of my favorite mechanics. For zombie horror, and when it exploits a creature, you counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability, which that's like chef's kiss for this deck.
Oh yeah. No. Beautiful.
So one thing that I'm interested in is zombie is super resilient and hard to stop once they kind of get going. But what are some of this deck's weaknesses, do you think, that it maybe struggles against?
Yeah, so the most obvious one is going to be graveyard hate. If folks are routinely exiled in graveyards, it's hard for me to pull anything back out of it, especially if they're doing stuff that says, like the rest in peace situation, where if it would die instead, just exile it so I don't get any of those death triggers off of my Vengeful Deads or my Undead Augurs and stuff like that. That can really scupper me really hardcore. I would also actually say, though, a weird, not hidden weakness, but a strange mirror match weakness maybe of Reanimator decks is precisely that. If I'm playing against another Reanimator deck, it's kind of difficult for me to cast my own Living Death, because that Muldrotha player, that Marin player, they might get more stuff back than me, and that's a little scary. There are also, I think, other general strategies that kind of stand out. Like if someone's doing direct damage with Punisher or kind of a Spellslinger vibe, like Wilhelt, as you mentioned, can be, Zombie Trample can take a little while to eventually like create its own momentum. So if something is coming out the gate faster than I am, that can be something that is difficult to catch up with, especially because so many of my zombies make me lose life too.
Yeah.
So that is also a thing. It's a difficult line to walk. And I'll also have to shout out my mom's flying tribal deck. She's got a Kangi deck that is all these things with flying. I have like one zombie that grants flying, so I'm usually very dead against spirits, against dragons, against birds, against thopters. I'm usually it's hard to deal with other stuff that's coming at me in the air until I find the right zombie to help me out with all of that. So there are a couple of different weaknesses, strategy based, but also graveyard hate is always going to be the bane of my existence.
Yeah, I feel very similar, and it's kind of funny how you have this back and forth when graveyard decks are playing against each other, because you it's an instant rivalry before the game begins, because I hate to do it, but I always put a Bojuka, like sliding my Bojuka Bog into my graveyard deck feels wrong, but like I know I have to do it, right?
Oh yeah. I play Bojuka Bog because I have to, because if I'm going to cast a Living Death, I need to use a Bojuka Bog on the other person's graveyard so that I get more out of it than they do. It's this weird rivalry that sometimes happens in a couple of games, and I'm like, wait, I'm supposed to be the graveyard player.
Yeah, and so this just made me think of one thing that perfectly goes back to what we were talking about earlier. When I kind of restructured my Marin deck a little bit recently, and your upping the average video on it was a lot of help. And one of the changes I made that was huge help was adding Author of Shadows, which it's this really sweet. I'll have to actually pull it up. I don't have it memorized, but it's a creature, and when it enters the battlefield, it exiles your opponent's graveyards. And for 5 mana, I think, and that seems like kind of a lot for that effect, but that deck also is running Living Death, Rise of the Dark Realms, and things like that, and it feels weird to not want to cast those big spells when your opponents also have big graveyards. So a card that I use in my Marin deck is Twilight's Call, which brings everyone's creatures back out under their own control, and so a card like Author of Shadows does help me mitigate whatever they might get, because I want to be the only one who's getting a bunch of stuff back. Like, this is a symmetrical effect, but I'm going to make sure with the other cards in my deck that it's not truly a symmetrical effect. Yes, yeah, that's exactly it. And Yeah, and it feels like such a cool like 1-2 punch when you exile everyone else's graveyards and then cast a Living Death, because it's like a board wipe for them, but like the greatest play for you. Oh man, that graveyard stuff, that just it gets me. I love it so much. Yeah, and then Author of Shadows, also anyone out there playing graveyard decks, take a look at it, because you can also cast the cards that get exiled from your opponent's
I think
graveyards.
one of them, he lets you take a single one of the cards that you get. But I mean, if their graveyards are big, the world's your oyster. You've got a lot of options. So yeah, he's a pretty terrific card, that guy.
I love it. Okay, cool. And then for Wilhelt, back to Wilhelt, are there any notable cards in this deck that fill the more generic roles? You know, I'm always looking for cards that can draw cards, mana ramp, or be removal, things like that, but also fit the theme of the deck.
Yeah, for sure. It was surprising to me to discover how many of the zombies are themselves fulfilling a lot of those roles. I mentioned Undead Augur earlier. There's also Archghoul of Thraben, or let's see, there's the Species Specialist, which isn't a zombie, but cares about my zombies dying.
Yeah.
Midnight Reaper is another one that draws me a bunch of cards when my stuff dies. I actually have been really, really loving Graveborn Muse in this deck as well, which is usually a very dangerous card to play in zombie tribal decks. 4 mana, 3/3. At the beginning of your upkeep, you draw X and lose X, where X is the number of zombies you control. Ooh. So you could draw like an extra 5 cards and lose 5 life. And this is not a May ability. You have to do that. So if your board gets too big, this thing could be your own worst enemy. But Wilhelt has a sacrifice trigger right at the end step. So if you are worried that this card will be too deadly on your next turn, Wilhelt just lets you get rid of it right off the bat. So it's very easy to mitigate for a bunch of those things. I'm also impressed by even some of the mana rocks that I'm able to, like, I don't know if manipulate is the right word, but like Heraldic Banner is an amazing mana rock.
Oh,
3 mana, you choose a color when it enters, and then it taps for that color, and it gives all of your creatures of that color +1/+0. And when you're making this many zombie tokens, that's so much extra power, and it's on a mana rock. It's amazing. I absolutely just adore that. So yeah, there's a bunch of those things that really help right from within the zombie horde itself, are providing you a lot of the very things that you need. So you don't have to necessarily go out of your way to find non-tribal effects or spells, instant sorceries, artifacts, stuff like that, in order to fulfill those roles, because the zombies are actually really good at it.
It's true, honestly. Oh, and I forgot to mention, but we will have a link to Joey's deck list in the description below, so definitely take a look. But yeah, as I'm looking at these sections, it's kind of amazing how many zombies just do all of these things.
Right.
Yeah, like we talked about Overcharged Amalgam, a zombie that's also a counterspell.
Yes.
That's incredible.
Or there are zombies that are removal, like Fleshbag Marauder is one of them. Noxious Ghoul is just an enormous powerhouse for this deck. 5 mana, 3/3. Whenever it or another zombie comes into play, all non-zombies get -1 for the turn. That's going to forever keep any enemy token players completely out of my way, and I'll be able to just totally demolish them. Fellstinger is another form of card draw that is a zombie scorpion, Crypt Breaker, Corpse Augur. There are so many things that draw you extra cards. And I've also styled the removal to be as zombie focused as possible too. So like I said, I play this deck a little bit like I'm not optimizing this deck to the nines. I'm playing it just like, this is a funny zombie deck. So the removal spells that I've opted for here are cards like Necromantic Selection, which destroys everything, but you get to keep one of them and it becomes a zombie. Or Necrotic Hex is a personal favorite, 7 mana. Each player sacrifices 6 creatures, and then you get 6 tapped zombie tokens. So even the removal also helps me sort of stylize myself for, I'm going to keep doing zombie stuff. So I'm not playing a Cyclonic Rift because, it's a Cyclonic Rift. I'm not going to remember playing a Cyclonic Rift, but I am going to remember that time I played a Necrotic Hex and made a bunch of zombies, and then the next turn I cast an Undead War Chief, and then suddenly they were all 4/3s, and boom, I attacked for, like, those are the stories that I'm so interested and invested in creating with this deck, and it's so hilarious to be able to do them because the zombies and the zombie support cards are doing all of this work that I don't know that I anticipated how synergistic the tribe was until I actually built the deck. And I mean, maybe what I might need to do is build more tribal decks. I think I've been missing out on a lot of these fun synergies because I've been so preoccupied with my Reanimator stuff that I actually need to dip my toe into tribal strategies more, because there are so many of these fun things that the cards themselves unlock so consistently.
Yeah, it definitely makes me think of what kind of hidden gems you can find, because, I never think of Necrotic Hex as essentially a board wipe, but that also makes you a bunch of zombies for yourself.
So many zombies!
But it totally is, yeah. And yeah, and I also wanted to talk to you about the section of cards that just give your other zombies like +1/+1. I don't know if I'd really realized it, but there are so many zombies that give your other zombies +1/+1 or some kind of buff. And
there are so many. There are so many. I call this section the cranberries because they're like my powerhouse zombies that really just they take me home. But yeah, Blade Stitch Scob is a 2-mana buff up zombies. Cemetery Reaper is a 3-mana. Death Baron is 3-mana. Lord +1 for all the zombies, and they get Death Touch. Diregraph Captain, Lord of the Undead, the Tomb Tyrant, Undead War Chief. Like, I also didn't realize how many there were, but there are so many. And there are also really fun ones like Calculating Lich. Oh, my handsome prince. Calculating Lich is a beautiful boy. He's a 6-mana 5/5 with menace, zombie wizard, and whenever a creature attacks one of your opponents, that player loses 1 life. So just by attacking, you're going to automatically get a bunch of damage before the damage itself even happens. And when you got a board full of tokens, it's really fun to play him. And it's even more fun to use Cleaver Scob to make 2 of them. I just, again, I'm getting these giggles about it because I get all the feels when I play this deck because these cards are so silly. I love it. Yeah, you'll definitely need to pull out a calculator when you start working on that one. It's so good. Yeah, that's the kind of the thing is, because I know merfolk have a lot of lords, or at least are known for it. Elves do too, but it's really impressive how many you can get out. And once you get 2, 3, 4 of these out, it's going to be like your tiny little tutus are going to be a lot scarier than that. And a weird, interesting thing that I've discovered about playing the deck too is that since there are so many of them, I tend to be less precious with them. Like I'm kind of eager to sacrifice my tokens for Wilhelt's ability so that I can keep Om-Nom on the Zom and draw more cards and stuff like that. But the lords themselves are so replaceable because I'm always going to find new ones because of the sheer density of the number of them, that I tend to be a little bit more precious about the cards that are a bit more unique, like the Vengeful Deads or one of my card draw engines or stuff like that. So that's an interesting byproduct of the deck, is that they are super valuable. I want to make sure I find them, but it tends to be pretty easy to find them. So that gives me a weird priority shift in terms of which zombies are most valuable to me on the board.
That makes a lot of sense, and it kind of makes me think of maybe that's a little bit of my problem with other tribal strategies is you really need this like critical mass of that creature type out on the battlefield, and so you're like very, like you said, precious about each one that you have. Like I have a Marrow-Gnawer rats deck, and when you get up to like 4 or 5 rats, you can really start going off at that point. But if like one of those gets killed or something and you're down to just 1 less rat token, it kind of can actually be a pretty devastating hit to the strategy. So yeah, it's really nice here that you can kind of just be like throwing away your zombie tokens here and there when you need to without worrying about it too much. I am very excited for this next question. It is, do you have any pet cards that you just can't resist playing in this deck?
So I mean, every single one of these could qualify, but I'll go for the weirder ones.
Okay.
I'll go for the stranger ones. There's, I think there's 2 here that I would shout out. The first one is, I don't know if this qualifies as a pet card, but it does like cause me to do something that I think is very silly in the deck. Like I'll shout out Field of the Dead here, which like Field of the Dead is a land that makes zombie tokens if you have enough lands of different names. And like we all know that that's a stupidly good card, so I'm not sure if this counts as a pet card, you know. But the thing that I like about it, the thing that makes it, I guess, feel like a personal choice for me, is that it also inspires me to use not just regular basic lands, but a mix of like islands and snow-covered islands, or swamps and snow-covered swamps, because those count as different names for the purposes of Field of the Dead. It helps me hit that 7 different name threshold more quickly. And I don't know, that is one of those, it's kind of a little silly, and I kind of just can't help myself. I don't usually see, like,
yeah,
I don't know if people really care that much about Field of the Dead, but I'm just like, oh, I got to change my basics. Like, so that's a funny thing for me is Field of the Dead. But, you know, that's also still a very zombie-tastic card, so that doesn't necessarily, zombie making card in a zombie deck. Does that count as a pet card? I don't know. So in that case, I have a different answer. A card that doesn't really have any business being in this deck, but I cannot resist. And that's Liquimetal Torque.
Yes.
Which,
okay.
which is probably like my favorite mana rock, despite myself. 2 mana, taps to add a colorless, or it can tap to turn target non-land permanent into an artifact in addition to its other types until the end of the turn. There's no artifact synergy in this deck. I just love this card. I just think it's amazing because of the political applications that it occasionally unlocks. Like, I'm playing blue-black. I don't have that much ability to destroy artifacts and stuff in these colors. But, you know, if one of my opponents is playing a Reclamation Sage and they're about to be able to destroy an artifact, well, maybe politically I could be like, well, hey, I'll turn that person's commander into an artifact and then you could destroy it. Or their planeswalker into an artifact and then you could just destroy it with your Reclamation Sage. So that is a card that doesn't necessarily, quote, belong in the deck, but personally, I love forcing that card wherever I can because I just think it's so silly when you have the opportunity to make political deals like that with other people.
I'm really glad that you brought up Liquimetal Torque because I was going to, if you hadn't. This one, it's definitely a card. As soon as it came out, I was like, yeah, okay, I need at least 20 copies of this for everything I'm building from here on out because just, you're right, like, it 90% of the time probably will just be a regular mana rock. But that like one game where you can like combo with somebody to take out the archenemy's threat or something like that. It's just so worth it. So good.
Oh yeah, I think I played on the rules committee stream, and at one point I want to say it was Scott Larrabee who cracked into Nivinaral's disc because he was playing a Super Friend strategy, and Nivinaral's disc would destroy everything but not all of his planeswalkers. And so I was like, all right, well, in response to that, I'm going to turn your Ugin into an artifact, and he's coming down with the ship. Like, it's those little moments that I'm just like, I'm going to remember that forever. Like, those are the things I want from Commander, is these hilarious little stories, and Liquimetal Torque creates a lot of opportunities for those stories, and I love it so much.
Yes, I'm such a fan of that card. I love it too. Yeah, it's great. And also, I really like Field of the Dead. One thing that I have been dealing with lately is, I don't know what it is, but they've just been releasing so many really cool blue-black commanders. And yeah, so I'm basically like copying and pasting my mana base from one to the next, and it gets a little stale after a while, you know? I want to like spice things up a little bit, and so I think adding a Field of the Dead, which synergizes with your zombie stuff, and then using that as kind of an excuse to maybe play some lands that you would normally play so you can get those name counts up.
Exactly.
I think that's really cool. Yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah, it's this little domino deck building. Sometimes adding one card isn't just adding one card.
Yep, it's true. Okay, so favorite cards we've gone through, and there are a lot of them. I just think fill your deck with cards that are your pet cards, and you'll have a good time. But the next question I've got for you is, what is the MVP kind of like card of the deck that you just want to see every game, and you're excited about it?
All right, I will not be able to restrain myself. I have more than one answer.
Okay.
so like Lazotep plating, it has really gone up in my estimation in this deck. Like sort of just in the format in general, but especially here. 2 mana instant where you amass 1, so you make a 1/1 zombie army creature, and it gives you and your permanents hexproof for the turn. That's pretty clutch because it can save you from some type of, you know, direct damage effect, for example, or it can save your commander from removal, and you'll make a zombie that he'll eat next turn, and then he'll create a token to replace it in addition to that. So I've been really loving that one. Whenever I have it in my hand, I feel a lot safer. That's a really great one. Repository Scob. Oh my goodness. Repository Scob is what a thing of beauty. So that's another one of those exploit cards. He is a common, just a little common zombie, a 4-mana 3/3 blue creature who can exploit one of your creatures when it enters the battlefield. And if you do exploit a creature, it returns an instance or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand.
Oh, wow.
If I get that card in my hand, I feel unkillable. My army feels indestructible because I'll play a zombie apocalypse, returning all my zombies from the graveyard to the battlefield, and then a Repository Scob will get back the zombie apocalypse, which can get back all of the zombies, which can get back the zombie apocalypse. Like, that is just a little common, but getting back these mass reanimation spells over and over again, makes you feel just on top of the world. So that guy's just a little common, but he pulls just so much work. Oh man, there's so many I want to shout out. I love Newsgraph Mob. I think that's a kind of an underrated token maker. It's like a 6 mana, starts as a 5/5, but every time players cast spells, it gets weaker and then creates zombie tokens, and then it usually dies. Or if you have your Diagraph Captains and your Death Barons, your Zombie Lords pumping it up, then it says it's a 0/0, but they actually get +2, so it sticks around. And you just make so many bodies for 6 mana. I love that guy. But okay, final answer. I have my final answer. Okay. Again, I told you I'm insufferable. My final answer, though, has got to be Sakashima's Will. Like,
ooh.
So Sakashima's Will is wild. And I was inspired by the folks when we were streaming on our EDH stream. There were some folks in chat who recommended this card, and I was like, okay, let me try it out. And it is, this has actually got to be my MVP card. Because I know I'm in for something special if it happens. So it's a 4-mana sorcery, and if you control your commander, you can choose both of these effects. You have target opponent give you a creature of their choice. You gain control of that creature, and this doesn't end at end of turn, so you just take one of their creatures. They have the choice of which creature, so that can be good, can be bad, but that's not the important part. The important part is that you also choose a creature you control, and then each other creature you control becomes a copy of that creature until end of turn. Boy howdy, it's such a, when you have a board of 2/2 zombies that are all decayed, and you're like, these are just whatever, and then you turn them all into undead war chiefs. So each of your zombies is giving each of your zombies +2/+1.
Oh,
when you turn them all into Diagraph Captains, so each of your zombies is giving each of your zombies +1/+1. It is so silly, and that's not even the only thing you can do with it. You can also turn them all into Wilhelts. So then you'll have a board full of Wilhelts, and then legend rule. They'll have to go away, and then each of your Wilhelts will see a bunch of non-decayed zombies die, and will give you a butt ton of decayed zombies. It's
okay.
Like, you can hear what's happening to my voice, right? Like, I get into these giggle fits with this deck. It's so beautiful and silly.
I didn't even think of using that to copy Wilhelt. That's incredible. Sakashima's Will is one of those cards that ever since Commander Legends came out, I've been wanting it to put it into decks, and I'm always kind of forcing it maybe when it shouldn't be there, because you never know what the situation is where it'll be really cool, and this deck seems perfect for it. So I'm really glad to see that there are so many synergies and things you can do with this card.
Sorry, I need to cool down after that, but yeah. It's just so beautiful.
I love
it so much.
And one thing I wanted to shout out was I honestly didn't even know about Repository Scob. That's pretty incredibly synergistic with this deck at just having a recent common from Crimson Vow. And that's incredible. I really love, one of my favorite things about building commander decks is just finding those little synergistic commons here and there, 25 cents, kind of bulk cards, and suddenly they're perfect for your commander deck. And that's one of the things that I love about Commander, is finding little hidden gems like that.
That one nearly passed me by. I nearly missed it because it is just a common, and it was from the set directly afterwards, and there was so much so many cards, new things being introduced. It's hard to keep up with all of it sometimes, and looking for these little blue commons wasn't necessarily a thing that was on my radar when I was trying to find other reanimation stuff to put into this deck. And are there any other cool zombies? And I was looking at these other big flashy cards from the set and getting distracted and stuff like that, because then there was a new preview season for Kamigawa also right around the corner. Don't let the commons pass you by. Repository Scob is easily one of my MVPs.
I love it. Yeah, and you had a recent episode of EDHRECast on commons played in Commander that I really enjoyed. And that's definitely something. Don't get distracted by the flashy mythics. Even though they're cool, you can still find some really sweet cards down at the lower rarities.
Yeah, sometimes the best cards in your decks are not the rares. Sometimes the commons can really overshadow the rares and the mythics. Sometimes they are the powerhouses in your deck. That was a really fun episode.
I love to see things like that. One of my favorite heartwarming things is that Grey Merchant of Asphodel, just this little common from back in the day, is such a powerhouse. And as a mono black fan myself, I'm always like, can I play Gary in this deck? I need to play Gary in this deck.
Oh yeah, and he's so silly. It feels weird to me to play him because I don't think of him as a zombie. I think of him as a thing that I've used in my Marin deck for ages. But it turns out he is a zombie, and I don't know. It feels kind of amazing when you have a Necro Duality in play, making another copy of Grey Merchant of Asphodel, and it's like, this silly. This is a little bit absurd. Yeah, you're right. He's just a little common, but oh man.
Yeah. Yeah, and one last one that I also, kind of just while we're on this topic, one last card that I wanted to shout out was Distant Melody, which is for a couple of reasons. The first one is, so it's 3 and a blue for a sorcery. You choose a creature type, and then you draw cards for each permanent you control of that type. And I'm always a big fan of this card. One, because it has fairies on the art, and this is the Faerie Conclave podcast, so love to see it. And another, this is another one of those kind of random commons that was forgotten about. So I'm glad to see it's kind of being reprinted for Wilhelt. That like any tribal deck or any deck that just has lots of creatures or permanent types in common. I guess creature types and then permanents of that type are what you draw for. But yeah, I just love this card. Drawing cards based on how many creatures you have out is pretty intense sometimes.
Yeah, I've easily drawn 12 cards off of a single cast of a Distant Melody.
Wow.
And that feels a little bit like, am I allowed to do this? Is this the rules let me do this? Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's just terrific piece of work.
Amazing. Oh, and one other thing. So this is a card that I know you are pretty famous for, or maybe infamous for, Joey, and that's Tombstone Stairwell. Which I see it in your maybe board, so I know it's not in this deck. But yeah, so I'm curious. Do you know? Does it just not quite work as well in Wilhelt as it does in other Reanimator decks?
So I wouldn't say that. I think that this also falls into one of the categories we discussed earlier about things that you've changed as you played the deck. So Tombstone Stairwell is one of the weirder cards out there, and for the record, I have it in like 3 other decks already. So y'all know I really like it. But it is a 4-mana enchantment, a world enchantment, if that matters. It has cumulative upkeep. That will not matter. During each upkeep, each player creates a 2/2 zombie tombspawn creature with haste for each creature that's in their graveyard. And that's each person does that. And then at the end of each turn, it destroys all of the zombies. And then on the very next upkeep, it will make all of the zombies all over again. So I use this in my boy Sir Conrad the Grim, which is I like also among my top 3, maybe my number 1 deck. I've got this in Marin as well. Like, this is an amazing token creator that forces everyone to make tokens. And if you've got a Blood Artist in play, then everyone's dying basically immediately. If you've got Sir Conrad in play, he witnesses so many creatures die every single turn that, yeah, I don't know, people are just not surviving. But since I've used this card in so many of those other decks, it tends to be, for me here, I'm like, I've seen that Aristocrats-y sort of style in my other decks, and I love those win conditions there. And I did initially, I was wondering, should I also put that in here? And I think my first draft of the deck, I did have it, and I think it would be really, really excellent. But it happens to be a thing that I've done elsewhere, so here I wanted to be a bit more straightforward. So it was one of those things where, you know what, I bet that this would be an excellent way to play the deck, but I'm going to go a bit more brainless with it because I just want to have some silly fun playing against my folks or whatever. So yeah, absurdly powerful card. Use it. It's terrific. It's hilarious. Anytime you cast it, your opponents will be like, I'm sorry, what does that card do? And then they won't believe you because how can this card do all of those things? It's absurd. But yeah, no, I like that card a lot for sure. But in this particular case, it's just an instance of like, I'm already banging that drum in another deck or 2 or 3 or 4. So here I'm going to try and make it a little bit more unique, a little bit less optimized, and just focused in on a more silly experience.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that it's good to have favorite cards that you play in a lot of decks, but I'm glad to see, kind of going back to sticking to the purpose of the deck, which is to play a little more brainlessly, that trying to count all the creatures and then create all the tokens every single upkeep requires a little bit too much brain power that isn't as used as well as in Conrad or something else like that.
Yeah, I would say that Conrad's one of those. Conrad's probably not an end of the night type of deck, because Conrad goes hard in the paint. That's a deck I have definitely souped up, and I like being able to flip the switch, especially as you noted, later on in the evening. We're just like, I'm going to turn my brain off and play something silly. So a lot of the deck is designed to just be like, let's just have some fun. So Tombstone Starwell and a couple of other cards like that are a way for me to differentiate between the types of experiences that I want. Even though they're all based around the graveyard, I do get to have different experiences with the graveyard from deck to deck.
Man, that is the thing about the graveyard. You can do so many different things with it, and the possibilities are endless.
Endless.
Speaking of the graveyard, playing this deck, what has been one of your favorite moments in a game that you've played?
I think it comes back to Overcharged Amalgam, because that is, again, the zombie counterspell, but it also can counter an activated or a triggered ability in addition to just a regular spell. So are you familiar with Alias V's channel, the Elder Dragon Hijinks gameplay?
Yes, yeah. And it's kind of funny, actually, on the most recent episode when I interviewed MTG Mudsta, we talked about that specific series on Alias V's channel as the community spotlight. So we actually talked about it for quite a long time.
Yeah, it's terrific. Alias and Olivia Gobert-Hicks are terrific. Flippin' love them.
Yes.
And I was fortunate enough to appear on one of the episodes with them and with Rachel Weeks. And in that episode, I cast a mass reanimation spell to bring back all the dead creatures. And in response, Rachel sacrificed her remorseful cleric to exile my graveyard so that I wouldn't get anything back. And that's when I responded by flashing out that Overcharged Amalgam, exploiting itself to counter target activated ability so that my graveyard would not get exiled, and then I could revive all of my mess of zombies. That's been a terrific highlight for me, for sure.
Okay. Yep. That is iconic. And I'm glad you also caught that on film.
I was like, am I going to be able to get away with this? Is this going to happen? I rarely, usually when Graveyard Hate comes up, like when I first saw that Remorseful Cleric hit the field, I was just like, oh, I'm probably not doing anything this game. And then Overcharged Amalgam pulled me right back into it and put me back in the driver's seat. And so that was a total 180 of a thing that I was so pleased got to happen. And it makes me feel warm and fuzzy to stick it to the Graveyard Exile, because I'm like, haha, I did it.
It's so thematic too. Like you didn't just play any boring old like counterspell or arcane denial or anything like that. You actually pulled out the zombie that is also a counterspell. So yeah, incredible. I love that. Thank you for sharing. And
thank you for asking.
Of course. So we've made it. This is the last question that I've got for you in this interview about this deck. And that is, what advice would you give to other players who are also looking to build a Wilhelt deck?
Yeah, I would honestly, the vibe that I've gone with for these is to kind of just lean back and enjoy the ride. There are so many different zombie tribal commanders out there. And I think comparing and contrasting all of their different abilities is going to be really useful to help you find the one that actually appeals most to you. Because, again, you have dozens of those options. But that one word, zombie tribal, actually kind of ends up being a pretty big umbrella for a surprisingly nuanced strategy. The way that Wilhelt plays is not going to be the same way that Verena plays, or that Scarab God plays, or that Gizendralf plays, or that Sidisi plays. And that's kind of what I've discovered about playing Reanimator stuff in general, is that saying, oh yeah, it's a graveyard deck. Well, the way that a Muldrotha deck plays is going to be different than the way that Conrad plays, or that Carador plays, or that Marin plays. And I think it's fun to investigate huge categories that we kind of broadly, maybe we make some mental shortcuts or mental heuristics about like, oh yeah, I know generally what that category is about, but it turns out these categories are very nuanced once you look underneath that umbrella. The same with landfall, landfall decks, we probably all have a general sense of what landfall means, but a Tatiova deck is going to play completely different than a Phylath deck, which will play completely different from a Mina and Den or an Omnath deck. So I guess that's kind of my thing, is like figure out what it is within that very broad category that more specifically appeals to you, and when you find it, enjoy that ride, because it took me a while to find this deck. A tribal strategy that I actually enjoy, and once I did, I love watching it do its thing. But I had to do some investigating within a very broad category before I could access that, and once I did, it brought me so much joy.
I think that's extremely useful advice, and yeah, and just kind of starting broad with the category of like type of deck you want, and then kind of honing in on what exactly you're trying to get out of it. I think that's a really good way to do it. And yeah, I've long been considering switching from Scarab God to something else. And this has given me a ton to think about. So a very good argument towards changing to Wilhelt. But of course, as I'm looking at the Scarab God compared to Wilhelt, they both have, completely different needs and different cards that you have to play in them in order to optimize and synergize with them. So yeah, much to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Find the one that works best for you. And sometimes trying them out is going to be the only way to figure it out. But once you do, I don't know, it's just fun to go nom with some zoms.
I think that's a perfect way to finish off this episode. Nom with some zoms.
Yeah. Nom with the zoms.
It's so good. It's been such a pleasure having you on the show, Joey. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. This was a real treat. I'm tickled pink when folks are excited to see the stuff that I'm up to over here. And when I saw what you guys were doing too, I was just like, you know what? This is fun. This is cozy. I want to talk about some Commander with these guys. Great.
Yes.
I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, I've been very much looking forward to this, and I'm glad that we could make this happen. Yeah, and as we kind of wrap things up, do you have any content or links or plugs or anything you'd like to shout out as we end the show?
You can find the content that I'm up to on our YouTube channel. Search up the EDHRECast for new episodes every Friday, and we have fun bonus videos like Upping the Average that usually come out on Wednesdays. If you want to follow us, social media coordinates on Twitter, for example, we're at EDHRECast. If you want to find me personally, I'm at Joseph M. Schultz on Twitter. And if you want to see me play Wilhelt or any of my other innumerable necromancy decks, we also stream every Wednesday at 6 p.m. on twitch.tv/EDHRECast.
Perfect. Yeah, and also we'll just have nice, easy links under this episode where you can go check out all of those things. Yeah, and so as far as the Faerie Conclave goes, you can find us on Discord and Instagram and Twitter. We also just started on YouTube, so check out our YouTube channel and listen to the episodes there if you prefer that platform instead. Besides that, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Take care.